Buju, wago shindigu minawa migizi indodem, gazagaskwa jime kag indun jiba. I've been giving some thought lately to the many losses that we have experienced through the pandemic and even just a shift in my own life. I'm in my 50s now, and I have had to bury both of my parents over the past 5 years and a number of other older relatives in our family and in our community. And I'm kind of in transition myself from being a young man to being a middle aged man and becoming one of the older people in some of the circles that I live and operate in. Through the course of this and my role as someone who officiates at traditional Ojibwe funerals, I end up speaking to a lot of people about death, dying, and grieving. And I wanted to share a little bit about some of our teachings around this more publicly. Before I do, I need to clarify what I can and cannot talk about in a YouTube video. When we do traditional funerals, the substance of what we talk about at the wakes, we speak to legends that explain about life and death, and at the funerals, we give instructions to the departing soul. I'm not going to cover those things here. And the reason is the instructions that we give a departing soul are really only shared in that context. And if I were to give voice to them in a venue like this, it would kind of be like I'm sending someone off. And we certainly don't want to do that. At the same time, there are broad teachings about how to deal with grief that are common, publicly shared, and can be really useful to all of us as we navigate this transition and experience that any of us who are lucky enough to live for a while will experience as we lose our loved ones while we're still alive. And as I share a little bit about this, I also need to put in a qualifier, which is that the Ojibwe are not one monolithic group of people. We are a large group of people with many intersecting, connected, but not identical customs and practices. So as I share a little bit about teachings that were given to me about how to deal with grief, I understand that other people from different communities may have totally different teachings or variations of these teachings. And I don't claim to represent anyone other than myself or the teachings that I was given by my elders. That said, I have a lot of faith in what my elders taught me, and I have seen and felt the power of these kind of teachings as I have navigated my own losses and grief, and as I've helped other people to do the same. So one of the first things that I often share with people when they've experienced a loss is that you are not alone. Anytime we experience a loss, we experience a disconnection from a really important relationship. And we can experience that in many ways as a loss, as an abandonment, as a challenge to our identity, even as we get very tied up in the relationships to people that we're close to. But we are never alone in the experience of loss. Everyone who loved the person who passed on shares in that experience. Everyone in the whole community experiences the absence of that person from that community and space. So we all collectively share in the loss. And something I appreciate about our Anishinaabe ways is that we teach people when you come into our space to remember that you don't have to check your problems at the door and turn the frown upside down and pretend like nothing's wrong. You can bring them right in, and we all share the load. And that's part of what it means to be communal. And so I've always appreciated that, navigating grief. In addition to that, a lot of times people are concerned about their relative who passed away. And I've found a lot of comfort in our traditional teachings around that, which include that we are not, it's not so much that we have souls, it's more like we are souls and we have bodies for a little while. We're not humans looking for a spiritual experience. We are spirits having a temporary human experience. And when we think of it this way, it has provided to me some measure of comfort to know that when my relatives have died, it wasn't the end, but a transition. They went on a journey to the spirit world and they changed worlds. And even in Ojibwe, we do not actually have a word for goodbye. We will say Gikawabamin or Gikawabamin Minawa, which means I'll see you or I'll see you again. So it's never goodbye. Whether it's in this world or the next, I'll see you again. And it's an affirming kind of soul to soul way to part with someone in just a social context. But even when we think about, at a funeral, it's not saying goodbye. It's just, I'll see you again. As part of the funeral instructions, which I won't get into here, we give instructions for the departing soul on how to get to the spirit world. We don't have a concept of judgment after death. There's no Ojibwe word for sin. We all go to the same place when we pass away. It's not like there's a heaven and a hell. And instead, we just journey on. Our bodies are actually made out of earth, and that's reinforced with all kinds of legends and teachings we have outside of this space. And when a baby's born, the spirit for that child goes into the new body and stays there as long as they live. And when we die, they separate again. So at a funeral, it's just the body that goes back to earth, and the ever-living spirit, the unique light, breath, and sound of the person when they were alive, that carries on. And that's what goes on this journey to the spirit world. Other things that we teach people about are to think about how to truly honor the relative who passed away, as ultimately they loved us just as much as we loved them. And if they had a wish for us, it would be for us to live long, healthy, happy lives. And the best way that we can honor our relatives who've passed away is to do our best to live long, healthy, happy lives, and not to be stuck in dark space. Now that's easier to say than it is to do. It's often felt like a fog when there's been a death, like I'm looking through the world with glasses that show everything in sepia tones or something like that. As we think about how to navigate our grief, we were given all kinds of tools to help us do that. They include the teaching about tobacco. So tobacco is kind of a tool that we use to pay for things. If we're going to harvest a plant, an animal, for food, something like that, when we make a prayer. And Wayne Buju, who was the first person who had ever experienced a death, really couldn't think about his grief or what to do until he made a tobacco offering. And what it did is it released a little bit of his grief so that he was able to think more clearly. And so one of the teachings we have is to take some tobacco, go out in the woods, put it by a rock, put it by a tree, put it in the water. And that doesn't magically make the grief go away, but what it does is it provides a mechanism to release a little bit of that grief, a little bit at a time, so that things are a little less hazy and it's easier to proceed with life. And so basic tobacco offerings are really important. We're encouraged to actually go to ceremonies, to participate in our culture, to pick up our ways and continue on with life. In some parts of Ojibwe country, certainly this is the case where I'm from, there's an active ceremonial drum community. And on some of the ceremonial drums, they do a ceremony called washing of the tears. In some places, they only do it for families of drum members. In other places, they'll do it for anyone in the community. And among the things with the washing of the tears ceremony, the first person who had been seated as a drum chief lost a relative and wanted to quit the drums and not have anything to do with the culture. But the people sat him back down. They washed off charcoal that he had on his face that he used to express mourning. They combed out his hair that he had left unbraided so as not to show vanity during his time of loss. They gave him fresh clothes and gifts. They used special songs and had their warriors dance around him and wipe his tears. And they did that with 4 different songs, and then on a 5th song pulled him up and brought him into the circle to dance again and continue with life. So this washing of the tears ceremony, in my area, we often do at the ceremonial drums, although there are other teachers in our region and other communities where they will just do this ceremony by itself, absent a ceremonial drum, a washing of the tears. It's just one of many ways we have for helping people deal with grief. In addition, we encourage people to pick up other tools in our toolbox. We have medicines, so some people make a tea out of bark from the east side of a popple tree. Others use cedar to make a tea to use for drinking and sometimes even as a wash. Sometimes people will even boil up some cedar tea and pour it right into the bathtub so that they can take a bath within the cedar water as a way of helping to release a little bit of the grief and deal with things. In addition to that, we tell people that when there's been a death of an immediate relative, that our grief is powerful. It could affect a wild rice crop in an area or a hunter's luck and things like that. So with each of our traditional foods, instead of just eating them right away, as they come into season, when the freshly harvested wild rice is harvested, when someone gets a new, kill of a deer, instead of just eating that food right away, we have a little ceremony and it's ceremonially fed to us with 4 offerings and then eating it on the 4th time. And that also helps us release a little bit of the grief and make sure that our grief doesn't affect, a berry crop, a rice crop, a hunter's luck. So there are actually ceremonies throughout the year after a loss for caretaking our sacred traditional foods. We have to eat those foods or we would have starved to death. But there's a little custom we use before we begin eating the newly harvested stuff. Things that were harvested prior to the passing are fine to eat, even at the funeral itself. Also, as we kind of caretake our grief, the most immediately bereaved have teachings about refraining from handling certain sacred items and things like that, just as a way of cautioning themselves from interrupting the positive energy around those things. We're still encouraged to go to ceremony and participate in our culture, but there's a way that we handle ourselves in order to caretake those things. So we're encouraged to participate, but to be careful with our hands-on handling of certain sacred items. In addition to that, when there's a death, we're told that the spirits are watching us very closely. They empathize with us. And one of our words, jawenim, which means to love someone, bless someone, or pity someone, might even be better understood of as to empathize with someone. So geshawenim egonanig manidug wanitasoyang. We are empathized with by the spirits when we experience a loss. And the spirits will watch us closely for that entire year. So in a way, we are told how we handle ourselves during that year immediately after a loss kind of sets a pattern for how our lives are going to go afterwards. So we are told to make extra efforts to be kind to our relatives, to seek out our relatives and spend time with them, even if it's just playing board games or cribbage or something like that. Because the spirits will see that and say, oh, these people want to be close to one another. And it invokes their blessing and empathy to those efforts. We are also cautioned not to engage with unhealthy things as we navigate grief. So we'll tell people, don't use drugs, don't use alcohol, even excessive gambling, or anything that could be addictive. We are told to leave those things alone and to pick up our healthy tools for dealing with grief and loss. So those are important reminders, not to fight, not to use chemical substances and things like that. When we have a hard time, and it'll kind of come in waves, we are also encouraged to seek out not just our elders who have a lot of wisdom to share, but especially those who have served in the armed forces, because they've faced death and loss in a way that is different from many of the rest of us. And they have a special kind of wisdom that they can use to guide us and to receive our pain and fear and confusion. And so I have found seeking the advice and counsel of veterans to be really helpful and positive. So that's something else that we're encouraged to do. Something else that we do in my family is, in order to think of our departing relative as the ever-living spirit that they are, we are told to take our pictures of them and put them away. Not forever, but for a year's time. And in doing so, we're told to think of them as the ever-living spirit that they are, rather than the physical form that we looked at and loved so much. And then after a year's time, to take them out, make copies, share them around. Our lives will be different after a loss, and so we are also encouraged to just rearrange the furniture in our house, to accept that nothing will be exactly the same. As we rearrange our furniture and rearrange our lives, we're also told to take the clothing items of our departed relative and give them away. So rather than leaving the person's room the way it always was, and leaving the clothes hanging in the closet and in the dresser, that can invoke us to be stuck in avoidance of accepting the loss. And so we give away the clothes. In some communities, there's a protocol for that. It'll be given to a drum chief from a visiting community, and then dispersed amongst the drum membership at their ceremonies. In other places, they have a feast and invite people there and then give everything away at that feast. In other places, they'll just take the clothes and bring them to someone and give them away. Once those clothes are given away, people who receive them are free to use them. And often we do the gifting outside of the immediate community, because if there are favorite shirts or things like that and we see someone else wearing them, it could be jarring for us. So often we rely upon our relatives from other places to receive some of those gifts. But that's not a universal teaching. That's what we do in my family. But some other families may just gift those things within the immediate community. Other things that we do, we feast our relatives who have passed away. So we send food to them. We wait until 4 days. Their journey takes 4 days, and then we immediately send food to them, which they receive and share with their other relatives who they greet when they make it to the spirit world. And we also can feed them anytime after that, when we're having a food that reminds us of them, something that they like to eat. We can put a little bit of food on a plate and put it out for them, or put it in the fire and say their name. We offer tobacco when we put out a spirit dish or put food into the fire to send to someone. And those things are also kind of affirming. We, acknowledge, remember, and send food to that person. But once someone's traveled on, they don't come back. We just send offerings to them. And that's an important thing to remember with those teachings. Um, Also, as we continue on, we give away the clothing items if there's important spiritual items. Someone had a pipe or whatever. Those things can be kept in the immediate family as kind of a family keepsake. Uh, and the grieving process takes a year's time. And we have steps to go through as we navigate that grief. What I've shared with you here is not a comprehensive list of all of our teachings about grieving, but these are some of the things that we do that I have found really helpful to me as I've navigated my own grief and losses, and I know they've been really helpful to other people as well. Another one that occurs to me that we often do in many places when they bury someone, there's no spirit house made. There's just a regular burial, and that's that. In my family, we do make a spirit house, which is almost the size of a casket. It goes on top of the grave. There's a hole on the west end, and that's one of the other places we can make offerings. That's not a requirement. It's just a way to mark the grave and to send offerings to relatives. But those spirit houses used to be made out of birch bark in the shape of a wigwam, and once we had, planed wood, we started to make those out of boards and things like that. But it's not even necessary to do that, although it's kind of a nice way to mark the grave. If you do a spirit house, those are usually kept up for 4 years' time. And then after the 4 years, it's allowed to degenerate and just kind of return to its natural state. Those are a few of the things I wanted to share with you about navigating grief and loss. And if you have this experience, by all means, seek out elders, veterans, spiritual leaders, and whoever ended up officiating the funeral for your loved one, as they all have wonderful teachings, advice, and counsel that can help you through a tough time. Peace and love to you all. Thanks for listening today. Miigwech. Thanks for watching today. I'm Anton Treuer. Let's keep in touch. I'm active on social media, and my website has lots of information on my books, speaking engagements, free Ojibwe language resources, resources for teachers, and more. Miigwech.